Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for being here. You can come in, please. Yeah, good afternoon again, and thank you for being here. And welcome to Humor for those who are coming here for the first time. I think it's 1 or 2 people. But this is the Attire Interdisciplinary Seminar. And I think this is the 6th seminar series for this quarter. And we are pleased today to have our brother, Musa Ndlovu, whom we fondly call Musa. And Musa is Associate Professor in the Center for Film and Media Studies here at UCT. He is a Mandela Fellow, was a Mandela Fellow at the W.E. Du Bois Institute at Harvard, and also a C-rated researcher at the South African National Research Foundation. He's a co-recipient of the 2024 Transatlantic Partnership Grant under the Democracy, Governance and Trust Call. And for his sabbatical and beyond, he is a co-PI and alongside Professor Sarah Gatta, the Simon Fraser University in Canada, and the Melbourne University of London, which during this period for this project, he will be engaged in a study in which they will be exploring independent journalism epistemology, which is on a theme enhancing democratic resilience in the age of disinformation, in a project called EDIT, E-D-I-T. And he is currently involved in the international collaborative study on the coverage of Russia and the Ukraine war. He's an author of a book entitled Fees Must Fall, and Youth Mobilization in South Africa, Reform or Revolution, that's published by Routledge in 2017. Today, Musa has chosen to speak to us on a theme that is dear to him now and within the framework of his work that he is doing. And for the sabbatical, which is entitled The Scholarly Study of the Meanings and Evolutions of African Transnational News Media Expansions from the 1800s to 2024. So Musa is going to speak to us between 20, 30 minutes or 40, and then after that, we're going to engage in a conversation. And some of that work was pre-circulated, I think, within. And we look forward to engaging you in that conversation. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Divine. Thank you so much, colleagues, for being here. I would like to talk to you about 3 things. On my side, I can't read my own slides, but that is fine. I'll try to read those over there. That's fine, I'll try. I want to start by telling you what my work is not about. I'm going to spend a great deal of time on that. I will do that for purposes of giving you context within which my work arises. Secondly, I'm going to tell you what my work is about. Thirdly, I'm going to tell you how I think the study of African-owned transnational news media ought to be studied. So the 3 things I wish to share with you today. So I'm going to begin by talking about just showing you American-owned transnational news media that are operating in the continent, that are growing in the continent. Some of them are not new. Some of them are new. What is key, and I wish you to take home, is that there is an intensifying competition between and among American, European, Asian, Latin American, Middle Eastern, transnational news media in the continent of Africa. So, my work is not about CNN. It's not about CNN. CNN is the most watched international transnational news media in the continent, but it is not about that. My work is also not about its programs that are tailored specifically for the African audiences. CNN, as one of the competitors in the continent and as one of the exporters of American soft power, has been growing strongly, deeply in the continent for purposes of not only attracting the growing African middle classes, but also of countering China and also of countering the Middle Eastern transnational news media. But my work is not about that, but this is the context within which I would like you to understand my work. CNN has a number of magazine type television programs that are tailored for, meant for, to make it visible, part of its brand identity in the continent. These are CNN Marketplace Africa, African Voices, Inside Africa, Africa Avant-Garde, and others that are not on the screen. So it is very serious about being in the continent and about growing in the continent. Some of you may not be aware of this, but we are also privileged to have Fox News. It's not a privilege. Those of you who subscribe to StarSat, are you familiar with StarSat? It's a competitor to DSTV. Not many people know it. I subscribe to it somewhere in other parts of the country. StarSat, which is a Chinese satellite platform, hosts Fox News International. I'm bringing this here because it is a particular brand of journalism. It is not only expanding to the continent of Africa just for the sake of it, but also to export a particular kind of conservative, sensational, dramatic, and other things, brand of journalism also. So you have a competition between and among Americans themselves, but playing itself out in the continent. Fox News would not be here if it did not want to be read, interpreted, decoded, and constructed in a particular way. But it is on StarSat. As a side, StarSat is one of those things you read about the week before last, where South African police and the ICASA went to take the material and disconnect them. Story for another day. But let's focus on this. StarSat also hosts MSNBC, which is now, if you subscribe to StarSat in the continent, you have access to MSNBC, which is an American news channel. You also have CNBC. Again, this is not what my work is about. You may now be aware that if you are subscribed to either DSTV or StarSat, you have access to Bloomberg TV. Not only just Bloomberg TV, it has its own a magazine or an aspect of it that is targeted to the Africans in the continent, Bloomberg TV, Africa. So that is the American. Let's talk about the Europeans. My work is not also about the BBC. The BBC is the second largest, so it's after CNN, and it has a number of programs that are tailored specifically for the African continent. It keeps on changing all the time. And what is also big about BBC is that it has moved its operations that are meant for the continent from London and opened headquarters for them and offices in Kenya. That is also in my reading because that's where China has its own headquarters. So the competition, what we should call here the second scramble for Africa's hearts and minds, is very intense. But again, that is not what my work is about. Also, France 24, which like BBC, has a longer history in the continent as a colonizing power, not France 24, but France. It has grown phenomenally in the continent. It used to be only in French. It has also expanding through language. It is now also in English. It is signing memoranda of understanding with various broadcasters in the continent. It is not only France 24, but Radio France International. As you know, my French is excellent. And also it has also, like CNN and BBC, particular kinds of programs that are tailored specifically for the African continent. It's called African Eye on Africa. Sorry. What is important about French news media in the continent, more especially France 24, it is relatively new. French media has always been in the continent, but France 24 is a relatively new project, 2006. To take you back, the French had always wanted to have a counter to BBC. So you have a European competition playing itself out in the continent because BBC was also diversifying in terms of the language. But they did not do it for a very long time until the war in, was it the war in Iraq? What happened there is that the French president gave a speech at the UN. Everybody stood up and clapped. BBC and CNN showed snippets of his speech, but not the number of the people in the General Assembly clapping and the reception. So in short, the cynical me, France 24 is a product of not being clapped for. So all of these 24-hour news channels that are competing in the continent are part of the competition for regional superiority at a particular space, but that is playing itself out in the continent. The Germans were the first to kind of have media that was meant for audiences in the other parts of the country when the Germans were colonizing the continent. They were the first in 1932 to have transnational radio. They were among the first. We can talk about the British and its communication infrastructure, but we're not going to go there. But DW has not been as visible as it is now with its own African tailored program. It looks more flashy, it's more recent, and it covers a significant part of the continent, and it is forming relationships with other broadcasters in the continent as well. The Portuguese, they haven't really branched out of what we still call Lusophone countries, but they too are expanding in the continent, and their biggest competition being Brazil in the continent, but we can talk about that some other time. But they too, they have a magazine program that is meant for the African continent. Then we have Russia. Russia invades special operations, depending where you are ideologically, invades Ukraine or engages in special operations. And then the powers that be instruct DSTV in South Africa, or rather the company that provides the feed to DSTV, that you need to disconnect Russia today. We're now talking about the competition that is still in Europe, but playing itself out in the continent, and in terms of the competition for platforms. So DSTV, as you can see today, you have no Russia today. But again, the competition for technological platforms, Russia comes back because as if it had known that it was going to be disconnected, it had already been negotiating with some governments in West Africa and in Algeria, which is not, to come back. And then you would have Russia today in South Africa, and it came back as a French language channel and an English one, and is on Starset, which is Chinese owned. There's something to be said about Russia and Russia today. Russia is far more serious than others in terms of trying to undercut CNN, BBC, and everybody else in terms of soft power. That is, in terms of funding soft projects in the continent. In Central African Republic, it even sponsors the beauty contest, but that's fine. So, and also in terms of engaging in what we call sharp power, this is in terms of spying, this is in terms of sabotaging other media and all of that. And also in terms of military power in selling arms in various. It is not the only one. It is just that it is after year 2000, when Mr. Putin became the president, it became more visible after he had, kind of, after the 1990s, kind of disappeared in the continent. It came back big, and the funding for Russia today has increased. Whether or not people actually watch RT, that's a story for another day. China is big in the continent, and everybody knows that. I'm not going to bore you with that. It is one also of the media houses that has, it is one of the countries that has a number of news media in the continent that are growing faster and stronger. And China, the Chinese government, has in the last 3 years provided more money than any other broadcaster to broadcast for its media to be far more visible in the continent. Let's go to the Middle East. Here you have had Al Jazeera, which has been seen as a counterflow. And Al Jazeera has more news bureaus in the continent than any other. It wants to grow. It is growing stronger in the continent, and it wants to be, or it has been growing as a counter to Western transnational news media. But the part of that is the exporting of the Qatari soft power. If you go to 2008, the blockade of Qatar, the senior leaders of Qatar went around the continent talking to different leaders, because some of the countries that had blocked the movement of some of the goods and services for Qatar were actually in the continent. So there is a battle for regional superiority that is between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and it plays itself out also in the media. Qatar playing stakes in African Airlines, that's a story for another day, but you need to look at it in that context. And it is connecting with African filmmakers in terms of Africa Direct. Israeli 24 you may not have, but it is Israeli 24 was set up directly as a counter to Al Jazeera and the other 24-hour news media. And it is also available in the continent through the French-owned Canal Plus, which wants to buy DSTV. Nobody in the Middle East, if you locate Turkey there, has been as serious as Turkey in terms of countering China, the West, Saudi Arabia, in terms of establishing its own media. Turkey has a program where they invite African journalists to be present in China, in Turkey for these meeting African media kind of things. It is setting up media. Turkey has the biggest military base in the continent. As you will know, most of these superpowers and emerging superpowers have their military bases in a small country called Djibouti. So it is part of the contestation for the Horn of Africa. And TFT World is the Turkey one, and it is coming very big in the continent. And it has recently launched TFT Africa, and it is also broadcasting in Kiswahili. Iran is trying, but because of other things that has to do with sanctions, it has been, in my view, retreating in the continent. But if you go to Press TV, it has an Africa section, and it covers the continent in a particular way, different to how the other media cover. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it is not as visible as others on our day-to-day television screens. But there is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia money in some other countries where, as you said we are recording, right? But as we proceed, there is money as there is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia money in some of the media houses in the continent. And part of it is that the competition for the images for regional superiority is playing itself out, But I cannot move on without telling you that the biggest fight between Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya was on how the Arab Spring was covered in 2010 and 2011. The Arab Spring was a big issue for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Al Jazeera gave it more visibility, and the elite in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was not comfortable with the leaders that it had supported falling one by one. So that was presented differently in its own channel. And that the Arab Spring was happening in the African continent in the main. Lastly, in terms of foreign media that is in Africa, Telesa, which is owned by various Latin American governments, more especially Venezuela, is in the continent and is on STASAT, and it has been signing memoranda of understanding with various media houses in the continent. It intends to grow big in the continent, but I'm sure you're familiar now with the BRICS channel as well as one of the channels from the South that aim to counter Western media. So we should call this the scramble for the hearts and minds of the Africans. It is happening in the context of the decline of the West. It is happening in the context of what is called the rise of the rest. Then what? What is then, in this context that I've just given you, is the meaning of the rise of African-owned transnational news media. If you go to Mali, you will find a channel called Africa-to-Africa. It's operating without a license, but it's a story for another day. What is more important for me is how it positions, crafts itself. It is the idea that it ought to exist, and how it positions itself as the channel of the continent, not the channel of Mali, but the channel of the continent. And it has emerged in the last 10 years in the continent. That's what my study is about. My study is about All Africa, which is a news site that aggregates news across the African continent, and you will find it there. It is based both on the continent and outside of the continent. That is what I am studying. My study is about what you will call A24 or Africa-24 media. What is important here is how it positions and crafts itself as the African voice, not the voice of a particular region, not the voice of a particular country, but as an African voice, and it's seeing itself as Pan-African and available across the continent. It may not necessarily be CNN or BBC in terms of brand power, but the idea exists that this ought to exist, and it has to be branded, constructed as the African voice. My study is about Africa-24, another 24-hour news platform. It's about another 24-hour news platform that has opened in the last 20 years in the continent. The same thing that it named itself, not just a particular news channel, but Africa. All of these either have a prefix as Africa is a prefix or is a suffix, or they have a logo that has the continent on it. You will remember the South African e-news. It had to rebrand itself into e-news channel Africa. There is something about calling yourself Africa in the 24-hour news space. It changed its logo to look like that, to symbolize Africa. And it's also one of the 24-hour news channels that are broadcasting across the African continent that opened in the last 10 years or 15 years. If you are a subscriber in South Africa or in other African countries to Starsat, you will have access to Television Continental, which is a Nigerian 24-hour channel. It's available across the continent. It's new, and it's available in South Africa as well. It is part of this idea that Africa itself ought to have its own CNNs and BBCs. If you look at the Ghana's 24-hour news channel, Joy News, it's also part of the kind of branding that has the logo or the image of Africa on its logo. It's also a 24-hour news channel. It's on DSTV and on other platforms as well. This is not as visible, but it's a business news of the Ivory Coast. It's Business 24 Africa. And it presents itself as the African-owned channel and as a counter to CNN and other ones as well. Business Day is the South African one, is an extension of the Business Day newspaper. SABC has always been on this thing that it wants to be the wholesaler of news for the continent. It wants to be 24 hours, it wants to be Pan-Africanist, but the problem has always been the management of money in relation to the channel. But it still exists now as SABC News on Channel 403 in South Africa. And it claims to be available in 50 of the 54 African countries. That is not an innocent claim. There is a reason why it projects itself as the African media power. We are available in 50 of the 54 countries. This is something very big that has happened recently in Southern Africa. Arise News is a 24-hour Nigerian channel. On the 18th of April, 2024, which is basically yesterday, it opened or it started broadcasting for the first time in 10 Southern African countries. In Angola, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, and a number of other countries. And this is the continuity that I am talking about, and that you have African governments, you have African individual entrepreneurs, you have private media organizations that believe that Africa has to have its own 24-hour news channels. I'm not necessarily for now going to tell you about the ideological outlooks of each 24-hour news channel. I'm not going to tell you whether it is loyal to the Middle East, to Russia. What I am going to tell you is that the battle for Africans' hearts and minds is playing itself out in terms of these media as well. I don't know if you're familiar with a Pan-Africanist news stream called African Stream. Okay. On September 14th, last month, Anthony Blinken, we're familiar with him, spent a great deal of time in the Middle East. He singled out this channel where you have young Africans who invite guests, the news, that it is a Russian propaganda channel in the continent. It is not necessarily as Pan-African as it claims to. On the 16th of September, YouTube shut it down. So this is what I am talking about in terms of the competition for platforms, competition, the scramble for hearts and minds in the continent. So my question then is, how should we read the expansion of these news media? Should they be read as just part of globalization, an individual looking for audiences in the diaspora? Should we read them innocently like that? Are they part of their respective countries' soft power? Are they part of, are they extensions of certain superpowers in the continent, as Anthony Blinken claimed on the Pan-African stream? Or are they a realization of the new world information order that the Nkwi Nkrumahs and everybody else have always wanted in the continent? How should we interpret that, their images? Because they have been growing. Some of them are fragile, some of them are stronger, etc. If you go to Gabon, in the last 10 years, it started something called, an entity called Gabon 24. It's available in many other countries through the French-owned Canal Plus. It is both in English and in French, but mostly in the French language. In South Africa, if you've been paying attention, the African News Agency, which is part of the IOL partly owned by the Chinese, has been signing memoranda of understanding with various other news agencies in what you would call the Global South. It has been very serious about doing that. I'm sure by now that you know that we have Newsroom Africa, which is, look at the branding, and also it's very big. So how should we start studying African-owned news media? The problem I've had is that most of the people who study African-owned news media seem to really start either in the 1960s, or they study in they start in with the introduction of mass media in the continent. The mass media in the continent, is introduced in the 1800s, Christian missionaries. One of the things they wanted to do is basically spread the word of God in the continent and enlighten everyone. So one of also the things they said is to start journalism and journalism schools and the newspapers. Around that time, and there's something important, is that in the 1800s and before, around about that time, let's keep it at that, they emerged, or they emerged. You had Africans, the third generation of Africans, whose ancestors had been enslaved in the Americas and various parts of the world. They returned to Liberia and Sierra Leone. And one of the things that they did was to start newspapers. not newspapers as we understand them today, news sheets. So as you have newspapers starting in the southern parts of the continent, somewhere in Cape Town, you have at the same time starting in the in West Africa as well, where what you would call Black journalism has been far more vibrant than anywhere else in the continent. But we will get to that in the second part of this slides in this section. But my argument in this work is that we should start by studying the concept and the cultural significance of news in the continent, which has a longer history than the introduction of mass media in the continent. And the first part, our start should be with the anthropologists, whose work have been about how do people really consume news, in how people consume the news in what you would call, oral societies. I'm phrasing this very badly, but you get what I'm saying, that there has always been this concern about how people used to share news in pre-colonial times. I'm using the term pre-colonial very advisedly. When we do that, the benefits of that is that we do not create this gap between that. We don't create a sense that actually transnational news that started from one particular colony or country to the other started at the same time with the introduction of mass media. News in the continent has always been there, it has always been important, and people have always shared news. That is what I want to say. The second thing that I would like to say is that in the continent, before colonialism and before the introduction of mass media, news equally always had a transnational dimension. That's where I would like us to start. By that, I mean, if we accept that there existed statehood in the continent before colonialists, if we accept that there existed empires before colonialists, if we accept that they had to negotiate boundaries, treaties, trade routes, therefore we should accept that news circulated between nations. That is my argument, and that therefore it is important that we study news alongside the introduction of mass media, but that's not where transnational news began in the continent, as scholarship seems to suggest. And that part of our beginnings should be with African diplomacy. If we draw from anthropology and we draw from studies on anthropology and foreign policy, you will find that in many African countries before colonialists came, you have some of the empires that had well-established, sophisticated departments of communication. How will people understood that envoys and ambassadors ought not to be attacked? They needed to wear particular symbols. All that's dependent on communication, and that communication had to do with news, and it had to do with interstate news. Then we can start in the 1800s, where we look at, as my study does, at African-owned newspapers that had a transnational or a transcolonial dimension. You had the media in West Africa owned by Africans themselves that connected the reading publics in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Nigeria, in Gambia, and you had people speaking to themselves, but through printed press. That was not owned by Americans or anybody else. Importantly, that press also spoke to the people who were left back either in West Indies, in America, in other parts of the world, because the intelligentsia that settled in Liberia and in Sierra Leone had connections back home. So the newspapers circulated in that space. And importantly also, the ideas circulated in those spaces. And the thinkers of the time published each other's articles. And also, they allowed people in different colonies to contribute to the creation of, to the content of the newspaper. So they created these reading publics that were beyond the colony. This is what my study is about. And we should also strongly credit Pan-Africanism and the circulation of ideas. The newspapers may not necessarily be able to circulate beyond a particular colony because of physical infrastructure, but the ideas and the writings were able to circulate. So we should reconstruct the African intellectuals, not only in terms of they were journalists, most of them were lawyers and preachers, they were everything, but at the same time, they were very mobile. And then we moved to the 1960s when Africans became independent. You had media that was owned by Nkwi, Gamal Nessa, and others that was broadcasting to various parts of the continent. And then you also had underground transnational news media, be it the ANC's Radio Freedom, the Namibian ones, the Zimbabwean one, etc., as the media that was broadcasting across the borders to counter the British, the French, the apartheid government, the Portuguese, etc. And then in the 1990s, we had major changes in the media in the continent. So we're starting to see the privatization of the media, the commercialization, the decline of the monopoly of the state as a media owner as a monopoly, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of Cold War. And you're starting to see these media, but at the same time, you're starting to see the globalization of Western media. As much as you have this growth of CNN and others looking for the middle classes in the continent, parallel to that is the rise of China investing heavily in the media. And also, you have the likes of Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia forming relationships with African governments and the media. And you have Africa responding. And one of the things that you will come across is what President Kagame said, or President Zawe said. If Al Jazeera can succeed, there is no reason why African Al Jazeera cannot succeed. So you will now start seeing this desire also for what used to exist. And you have the Rwandan president saying, we should create something, whether you call it the Al Jazeera of Africa or CNN of Africa, or whatever borrowed name you may wish. We have that desire. And then this year, you have the owner of a Rise News channel that I told you about, presenting his desires and ambitions in terms of expansion, in terms of we will do for Nigeria and Africa what CNNs, BBCs, and Al Jazeera's have done for their nations and regions. You have a business person presenting his, not so much in business terms, but in nationalistic and in Pan-Africanist terms. So my reading is that these growth and expansions, we should read them in terms of a sense of the need for self-liberation. There's a psychological desire and a political desire that you can read it in terms of Steve Biko and Fanon, that they're not just news programs, even if they have commercial emphasis, but they're a continuity in terms of self-liberation. And that's where I end.
That was an abrupt end to a very enriching and exciting and thought-provoking, very informative, discussion. And there is so much to, first, so much to take away, and there's also so much to engage and so much to ask. I mean, thank you very much, Musa, for Also, you know, oftentimes those who are not in journalism don't understand how exciting it is, and media research, because it's also often a lot about just news, and also I think many people are trapped in the positivist framework of statistics and SPSS analysis and content analysis. So it's really good to have an analysis which is very deep in history, in philosophical thought, in epistemology, in political economy of knowledge production, power, state building, and culture, and lots of other issues. So thank you. I have lots of issues to raise, but I'm first going to allow colleagues. I will ask that we take another 15 or so minutes post, if colleagues don't mind. After
no chat question.
No, you cannot not have questions. You cannot not ask for not of questions. Also because this is very exciting work, and I think that it's very generative of many things, and since it's a work in progress also, I think it would be great to really engage many dimensions of it. But let me first ask colleagues. Wow, okay. This already, so we have 3 hands that are up. That's fun. Oh, 4 hands that are up. Okay, 5 hands that are up. Let me put the order: Fanit, Peko, and then the lady, and but let's start with Fanit. Oh, yes. Would you like before Amina? Let's start with. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it was also very refreshing to think about news and the ways in which they're consumed in that way. As an anthropology student, I found it very interesting. Somebody who's been researching the Sahel as well. I find it very interesting to think about like Russian propaganda and how that plays out in because I study WhatsApp statuses, and that's how people kind of communicate, like interpersonal communications, and that's how research participants and how rumors also travel. And so I often see statuses from some people about like Putin traveling in a plane with like drones around, and like they would like post a lot of videos of Putin doing things. And Putin has now become this kind of aspirational name. And yeah, so I was wondering also, so it's more for comments, but then could you just repeat the name of the news channel, refugee propaganda channel that you mentioned? And also in terms of the like oral traditions and like the ways in which news travel. For Burkina, for example, when there was a coup, the way that news traveled was through Facebook, but then also WhatsApp statuses and like videos that people posted. And so I'm wondering about like the similarities with oral traditions and how that kind of morphs into a kind of visual tradition, but then in the ways in which people communicate. So I would believe news from a WhatsApp status from my friend more than like national news, because people just don't track the date also. So like this oral versus like visual kind of transition is very interesting if it's really the transition. It's more of a comment, but something that yeah, I'm good now. And also the MOUs, I wondered like what it looks like. I might be able to find it if I just try to figure it out on Google, but I guess I wanted, because you spoke a lot about it. Yeah. That's about it.
Can I respond to that? Well, the social media space has become a game changer in terms of disinformation, misinformation, and all that. And global, the governments are involved in that as well, which is why then America will get into pressure YouTube to shut down the African Stream and others as well, because they feel that there are platforms that Russia uses to communicate its messages in the continent, more especially where it is involved Central Africa and in the Sahel. And we have seen also that not only is it involved, the whole point of a government speaking to the media in another country is not so much to communicate to its equivalent government, but to influence the people because of the culture of orality that's still strong in the continent. And that's where also the governments are playing in terms of spreading certain images about who is the bad guy, who is the good guy. That is where the disinformation is in the continent. That I would study, but if I was going to speak about that, I was going to but in terms of what I said, in terms of soft power, sharp power, and hard power as well. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go.
But if you were to actually take the contents from launcher as what is the name of the popular channel sort of thing? The popular it has different modular. So if you had to take content from modular, translate it into those 20, expand it up, what do you think? What would that be like? What do you make out there?
If I were to take content from modular,
translate it into 24 hours and expand it to Africa, really, like what would be your take in relation to what you're talking about?
modular not necessarily being a traditional news channel per se, being about all these other dramas that are going. Okay, let's start from. So, if I were to take modular,
Yes,
and make it an Africa-wide content.
Yeah,
just make it to 24-hour news. Take the content and try to translate it into news.
yes.
And then
Where people are fighting about relationships.
it's a whole lot of topics.
Yes.
So, but then that is the message that I'm just wanting to see the relevance of all these agencies that you're actually putting out there.
Yes.
Do we read with, if we actually, because you're also talking about going way back, how we communicate.
Yes.
So we're taking something on the ground, we try to translate to see how they actually can will that compete?
Okay.
Well, I didn't want you to say compete. I just wanted to hear your
I'm going to start where my study is also not about. Okay. That what I focus on kind of strictly is what you would call conventional news. Okay, not these other topics. So, but one of the ways that governments and other spread influence has actually been by introducing news topics in the spaces like modular, where they become an everyday talk, because people relate more to those things. And also during around the time of campaigning, you may also find politicians appearing in spaces like those, because that's where the people are, okay? So it is one possible to take a platform like that and make it continent-wide. And it will be very, popular. It will be about all kinds of topics, including disinformation, etc., etc., etc. I will pack for now my ideological views about DSTV's construction of blackness. That's a story for another day. But that is possible. And if you look, just to extend in terms of what Turkey and China are doing in the continent, is to expand, and India as well, is to expand soft power through telenovelas, be it Bollywood, and that's where people are, and they are consumed a lot in the continent. I hope I've answered your question.
We're going to go to Naledi. And then there's also a question online. I've noted, Deshni, I've noted your question. So, Naledi.
Are they intentionally targeting the athlete? And if so, why? For one, and I'm not anything, what is the evidence that chases?
Yeah.
Why is that the case?
Thank you for that. And I think it's a very interesting question. And it's part of the exploring the meaning of this. So in different, let's take DW, for example, the German one, which you have in some parts of the continent, broadcasters and media houses that do not have the financial strength to produce their own content. So those then become vulnerable, because what in the past the Chinese and even now will do is to provide you that content free, because it is state funded and it is aimed for propaganda. And the policies also in other countries may not be, let me put it this way. So if you have this broadcaster that needs to fill space, needs to fill content, and you have free content, and also ideologically, this is aligned with your worldview. You get that content, and it is not necessarily on a pay on subscription channels, but on general state-owned broadcasters, because the board, the states, the managers may be in line with China, Russia, or anybody, or the Germans, etc., etc., etc. You're getting free content, or you're getting it cheaper. So in different countries, that's what then also the study is about to do. Who is, for example, let's take the South African. If you look at IOL, you are going to see the Chinese ambassador writing a full spread. You will not see it in Arena Holdings owned media, the Times, the Sunday Times, etc. I think 3 days back you will have found celebration on front pages of the IOL of the Chinese-South Africa relationships. That is just one. So you will also have Chinese lobbyists. I'm not picking on China, I'm just trying, saying to many Africans that also use us as your news agencies. So what you are seeing here is not so much that these have become CNN. America is still very big. And also, you will find that American, to answer part of the question, that they tend to be far more commercial. They are not state-owned. They will be more interested in affluent classes. But others, right now, I have DW, I just downloaded it for free on YouTube. Al Jazeera is free on YouTube. France 24 is free for YouTube. Somebody else is paying, but somebody else is not paying. The aim is to spread their content far and wide, importantly also in different African languages.
Mojane.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it. And I want to be very careful in terms of asking you something that you are talking about and not something else. I mean, when I'm listening to, the way in which you frame your argument, I think it's very interesting and it's a very strong argument, because when you look at mass media, you study mass media from the 1960s and so on, it doesn't really give you the context in which this has been unfolding. When you go back to the 1800s, which is that you are using the term advisedly, the precolonial era. I think it's interesting because we see this as a period in which we begin to see the emergence of, I mean, many African countries, even in Southern Africa, people are learning how to write for the first time, and they are putting out their stories out there for the public to consume. So I think it's very interesting when you have a very strong argument in that regard. I was a bit concerned about your usage of some of the terms because I also come from a political science background. So I've been applying some of the terms in the manner that you are applying it. But I've been cautioned about some of the terms like the use of statehood. You know, when we talk about statehood, there's arguments that, I mean, they were not understood in the sense that we sort of understand them now. Because, I mean, there were boundaries, as you talked about.
Yeah.
There was some sort of what I would call diplomacy.
Yes.
But it wasn't the standard diplomacy that we understand today, and the international relations and stuff like that.
Yes.
So when we talk about, I mean, you kept mentioning the exploitation of soft power by the American broadcasters. And so I would like to think, don't you think it's the same thing where there's African media houses that have wishes of expansion across the continent? Isn't it also about driving national interest to other countries? Because, I mean, you talked about Arise. I don't know if that was that funded the Arise party in South Africa.
No. No. Let me answer your question before. One, in terms of how do we describe statehood and all of that, and whether we should, that also has to do with language and power, and whether or not the existence of particular geographic political entities in Africa pre-colonial time should be called states. Or, so who gets to decide whether they should or shouldn't? We can have that debate until we're blue. But then to answer your questions in a way that is very clear in terms of the expansions, let's take the South African channel called it's the SABC is the manager of that channel, Channel Africa, the radio one. It is in different African languages. The sponsor for that channel to operate is the Department of International Relations. International relations has nothing to do with broadcasting, but it says, this is very exciting language. It is aimed to export South African values.
Yeah.
So, I don't know what those are, but all of these, but that's why that I'm studying this. As to, if you look at where Ghana was post-1960s and what Nkwi Nkrumah was at that particular time, his vision of cross-border media, I think is different to what you get now with the other powerful group that is broadcasting in the continent. So it is those changes that I am talking about. But at the same time, you have some of the African states. There's a big debate in the SABC. We should keep the channel. Others are saying, really, we may not have the money. Transnational broadcasting is expensive. Are we broadcasting because we're adding any value? It's just our egos. Why are we doing this? So what is the meaning of it? Why are we doing this? Yeah. Recently, Algeria just announced a cross-border radio stations. It had journalists from all over the continent. Why? That is what I'm trying to,
Just to wrap up, sorry.
Yeah.
Interestingly, when you talk about transnational broadcasting also, I did hear that there was Metro FM, which was situated in the US, and it was piloted by a local artist like Tibotage. So I think it still ties to that thing of sort of meeting.
Actually, I need to say something very important here, because given that all other media, in inverted commas, are basically digital or they have online presence, they're basically all of them international. What I'm more interested in political communication theory terms, it is the intentionality, the sense that we want to set up offices in another country and broadcast in another continent. We want to invest money. We're going to hold meetings. We're going to use technology. We're going to sign contracts, etc. We want to be available there. Is it because you want to, advertise it? Is it because you want to spread Nigerian love? Is it, why are you, that's the idea that, is it because you are so annoyed with CNN and the way it constructs, the Middle Eastern war? Is it because, so those are things that I'm really concerned about.
Okay, since we're talking about the love of money, I'm just going to ask the question online by Deshni. Through your studies, have you heard anything about whether funding that seems to be slowing down from international funders to locally owned media is related to them investing in these larger organizations instead?
What happened was, one, just before 2020, somewhere there, the international broadcasters were withdrawing, more especially the ones that were state-owned. Until Hillary Clinton, you may know her, who was a Secretary of State then, presented a detailed long style in front of Congress. And she said, I have seen Russia today, I've seen Algeria, Al Jazeera and others. They are very instructive. We are losing the information war. And then immediately after that, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, with the, who is the gentleman who engineered or started to Brexit and lost him? Yes, him. Anyway, after that, BBC started to expand. Okay, part of that expansion is necessarily a reaction to Al Jazeera, Russia, China. That is one. So in terms of international funders, more especially around COVID, they started withdrawing their money because nobody else had money, including also at some of the universities where they were training journalism students. So I don't know if I'm answering that question.
Yes, you are.
So there is that, but they're caught up in a situation where if they don't fund, Saudi Arabia has the money to fund. Qatar has the money, the Chinese, the Russians are serious. So we are seeing this, that they do not necessarily want journalists to fall into the other camp. And I would like to direct also the asker of the question to a speech by Thompson of Reuters in 1960. Where we are today is where we are pre-independence, where the Western media and Western governments felt that they were going to lose the information war. So part of them was to engineer an information atmosphere where CNN, BBC, and everybody else were going to be as dominant. And you can go to disclassified files now. You remember Prime Minister Macmillan? He was British, presented a speech, The Winds of Change in Cape Town in 1960. We were all teenagers by then. But part of it, the secret files you'll get now is how much money was channeled to the colonial office to either buy out certain media houses that were not in line. And then also the Russian ones post the fall of Stalin. You remember that, I'm going to be closing soon. Stalin had very low regard, I'm sorry for those who love Stalin, for African liberation leaders. He thought they were just part of the bourgeois. Nobody negotiates their independence. You just go there and take it. But when he died, that's when Russian media started to really engage with the African continent. And that's where also, we're going towards the 1960s. And the battle at that time becomes stronger because it was clear that the information sphere was going to, you had people that you had colonized. And some of them, or most of them, socialist communists, were most likely to fall into the hands of China Russia, etc. So, but you needed to own the information space. And the British owned a very strong communication infrastructure, and that worked to their advantage.
Great. We have two last questions. I want first from Amina, and then we'll come to you.
Yeah, I joined everybody just in how informative and great and wonderful the presentation was. Thank you so much. I'm very curious about the infrastructure of African-owned media. And I'm really wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how does the hosting or satellite infrastructure work in terms of displaying and being available to various countries on the continent?
Another a great question. The people who have been doing at least three things or two things. It's the Chinese working with the government in terms of moving from analog to digital, but at the same time, for a lack of a better word, flooding the continent with and hosting African-owned platforms as well. But to the degree that you are, as comrades will call it in South Africa, you are aligned. So the infrastructure itself is politics, in the sense that you remember there was a great channel in South Africa called ANN7, owned by the Guptas.
Yes.
By great, I was being cynical. But it moved from DSTV. Maybe because it was underperforming, because it was not ideologically aligned, but the platforms are in and of themselves politics, including the closing down of the African stream. It is not my argument that it is not Russian propaganda, but part of what we are dealing with in media is the ownership of platforms and the content that can circulate there. If you can close African stream, that is power. If you can close ANN7, that is power. I'm not ANN7 saying ANN7 was innocent in any way. I'm simply saying you can allow it to be on the platform and you can have power to shut it down. So that also goes with many other platforms. Just another thing, I'm trying to answer a question. The study that Prof talked about, that we're collaborating in looking at how the Russia-Ukraine war is being covered. We're going to publish one of the studies in an American journal. And one of the colleagues who's based in Russia just started to spell Kiev in the way Russians would spell it. The editor of the journal in America melted. Completely melted. And when people are screaming at each other in their different time zones and you can't sleep, it's a lot of fun. But the point is that Kiev could only be spelled in the way that America approved it. You get it. So the infrastructure in and of itself is politics. And we do not own much of the platforms through which. And that, by the way, is a historical problem where you had a number of news outlets in various parts of the continent that could not financially fund themselves. And the publishers who held different views could not necessarily start their own newspapers. They had to rely on, welcoming white liberals, etc., at that particular time. Okay.
Last question to Prof. Ndlovu.
Thank you. My name is Gad. I wonder how much your work extends to ideological positions of African-owned transnational news media. The Economist, which is painting of which is behind you, has a very interesting tagline along the lines of banishing ignorance, promoting or advancing economic liberty. How much does your work get into those sort of ideological positions within this African formula media, which are present in different ways in the media that they want to place, CNNs, BBCs, etc. Second question is how much, whether your work extends to how much backing, state backing this focus group study is, because those that they want to place actually have strong state backing, including those that claim to be private, commercial, independent, etc. Then I found the last slide about the comments from Becky from Kagame a bit disorienting, because this idea that there must be an African vibe of something, not have an African Al Jazeera, an African BBC, an African is disorienting, put it in American terms. Otherwise, then what? Then what if you have an African Al Jazeera? What is it supposed to do differently than Al Jazeera is doing? Which things about running contestation about the so-called African store. So I find those comments, men in general, those men very, very disorienting.
I am really very interested in talking to you about that particular different view, then what part. I deal with that, I think it's chapter 3 or chapter 4 if I'm trying to. The first thing I do is how I look at how these channels or whatever, they frame themselves. That we are a Pan-African channel, we are for Africans, we're the voice of Africa, etc., etc. That is not an innocent statement, it's constructed by history. So I look at that in terms, ideologically, in terms of what that means. And then I look at the political economy, who owns you, who funds you, etc., etc. Not so much in terms of content analysis, just superficial in terms of what are you about, where you come from, and I look at that. And I have a particular sentence that answers your question in what I am writing, where it may very well be that the international media may not have been nice to Kagame and Thabo Mbeki. Therefore, the desire, so I don't treat the desire as monologue. That the desire is not so much because you desire this for the larger African populace. It's just that you may not be treated well by CNN and BBC. And you feel that if you were, that may mean that once we have it, therefore you will then want it to be within the realm of your control. Or it will never be African enough until it has your worldview. So that is dealt with. But there is something also deeper in that. If, for example, all of these media, this is one of the things that were very nice to us, super, super nice, will the need in and of itself for an African news media, for example, still exist? So that's some of the things that I am dealing with. That's why I frame this in terms of desire, as to what would be the meaning of that? Is that an issue of just because other people, because that's where desire comes from also, because other people own something, why can't I then have it? Would it articulate it in this? Let's say Al Jazeera was just like, so we were all happy, and will there still be the need? And that is one of the first questions I was asking some of the, what you would call in focus groups, in-depth interviews, what you call expert interviewees. So you ask them that, does the need in and of itself, let's just suppose CNN was super nice. there was no American imperialism. Will the need still exist? So that's where then we deal with issues of reaction, ideology, and I don't know if I'm answering your question. Sure.
Yes. If you don't answer, it's a very good thing because it creates space for more discussions. I have to end, even though there is still so much to discuss. So, but we should thank Professor Ndlovu for a very rich discussion, but also really deeply grounded in research, but also in theoretical work in history, but also for the provocations which generate more knowledge and for especially making media studies even more exciting than many people seem to think and understand. It takes me back to my own days. I started in media studies, and it was media research which actually got me to research itself. So thank you very much for bringing back that onto the table. So we have to end. Really, there's so many questions, but I know we have many more opportunities to have you again during our retreat. So we're going to have this conversation even more deeper. But we have the next seminar is going to happen on the 24th, and we will have that online. So you need to consult both the website and also our newsletter. And I also know that we're going to have a short review of the talk, which we'll make available at some point for other colleagues. And also you can always contact Professor Ndlovu or Musa, as we fondly call him, in the media department. And even though he's on sabbatical, he is very available.
Next year.
Okay.
This year you can ask me questions. I can also have a request if it's okay.
Please.
It's difficult to be in many African countries. So if there is the kind of media outlet of the type that I have here that you've come across, please let me know. Not Mojala. But of the type that claims to be a news or a documentary, that claims to be, that some of the things that beyond the realm of you because of language and your location, it's difficult to have everything, to know everything that's happening.
Yeah, some of us grew up with ERTNA. It's currently called the African Union of Broadcasting, but it's the Union of National Radio and Television of Africa, which I think was the political arm of the Organization of African Union at the time, but now it's still part. So I'm looking forward to the exciting work that will come out, and also to the book, but also to lots of conversations around it. So have a good afternoon, and thank you for your patience, and thank you for the generosity. You can see